Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Mike Dennis. I'm your host for this Meet the Analyst webinar, another in our series with our partners Edison. Today, we're going to talk about immuno-oncology.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for the intro, and great to be back with ShareSoc. We have this report out today. It's one of our sort of flagship thematic pieces, addressing what we think is actually a very compelling investment theme in the healthcare space. Jyoti's going to walk you through it. She is the author. She's done a lot of the work. She's spent a lot of the companies in this space. We're going to try and break it down for you. Just to give you a little bit of a synopsis as to why we think this is interesting. Jyoti's going to get into a little bit of detail, but the old way of treating cancer was effectively like poisoning in it. This is training the body's own system effectively to fight back. There is some structural forces which are sort of making this space interesting. In particular, there is some patent cliffs within big pharma, and so there's an urgency within the industry to get to effectively this sort of next generation of treatment. Jyoti's going to take you over the sort of 5 pillars of the report, and this is something which I think is a space which is very active. You're going to hear a little bit about the sort of innovation in the space, the interest in the space. It's got all, because of the interest, you see partnerships, M&A, etc., driving the space. So we'll try and take you through the report. I think the aim is that we're going to spend about 30 minutes just walking through it in a sort of Q&A format, and then please do ask questions. If you've got any questions, I will hopefully pick them up through the Q&A tab and direct them to Jyoti to answer. So Jyoti, welcome. So before we start, I mean, immuno-oncology has been sort of one of the biggest areas in the pharma area over the last decade. Let's just break it down a little bit. So before we get into the detail, can you take a step back and actually tell us what is immuno-oncology and what's so exciting about it?
Sure. Thanks, Neil, and thanks for members of ShareSoc for joining in. So immuno-oncology is fundamentally a different way of treating cancer by stimulating our body's own immune systems to recognize and attack the cancers. Now, we all know about chemotherapy, which is the traditional way of treating cancers, and that works by using toxic compounds to directly kill the cancer cells. Now, that is also an effective treatment, but it also damages healthy tissues and is typically associated with significant toxicity and short-lived responses. Immuno-oncology, by contrast, doesn't attack the tumors on its own. It activates the patient's own immune system to recognize and eliminate the cancer. Now, that's a powerful shift because the immune system is highly precise, adaptable, and has lasting memory, which is why we sometimes see deep and very durable responses that continue even after the treatment has stopped. The second thing which we would like to highlight at the outset is that immuno-oncology is not a singular approach. In our report, we focus on 3 core pillars. The first one is checkpoint inhibitors, which is also the largest market within immuno-oncology, but also overall oncology. And you must have heard about drugs like Keytruda and Opdivo, which sort of take the brakes off our cytotoxic T cells, which are the main killer cells of our immune system, and allow them to attack the tumors. The second pillar is cancer vaccines, which basically act as immune primers, which train the immune system to recognize tumor-specific antigens. And the third pillar is cell therapy, and in particular CAR-T, where the patient's own immune cells are genetically engineered to hunt down cancer in a very highly potent and precise manner. Now, what makes this field so exciting is the real impact it has had on patient outcomes. Specifically in blood cancers such as leukemia and myeloma, CAR-T therapies have delivered near curative responses. And in aggressive solid tumors like melanoma and non-small cell lung cancer, checkpoint inhibitors have extended survival from months to years, something which we have simply not seen with past treatments. So, clinically, immuno-oncology has introduced the possibility of long-term disease control. Commercially, it has some of the largest drug in the market. I mentioned Keytruda, 30 billion in sales in 2025, the highest for any pharma drug. So we believe that the combination for durable patient benefits and a multi-billion dollar franchise is what makes immuno-oncology one of the most important and investable themes in healthcare today.
Thank you, Jyoti. And I mean, for those who've not, I'm assuming a lot of the ShareSoc members haven't looked at this space. I think it's useful just to frame just where we are effectively in this journey. So you've talked about the fact that actually you're seeing tangible outcomes from this. This is not, something which is at the very early stages of development. It sounds like it's quite mature. Where are we in the immuno-oncology journey? And more, I guess, why does this report matter to us now?
Exactly. That's the main question we're here to answer. And we mentioned checkpoint inhibitors and them being the most successful drug class in modern pharma. So today we have around 8 checkpoint inhibitors which are approved, and together they generated more than 60 billion in sales. Clinically, they have been transformative for the patients who respond to the treatment. Now, the challenge is that only around 20 to 40% of the patients actually achieve durable long term benefits from these treatments. And the reason is the enormous biological diversity of cancer. So many of the tumors which we now see are called immune cold tumors. So basically, they're effectively invisible to the immune system. And even in the case of patients who respond, resistance frequently develops over time. So, while the first generation of checkpoint inhibitors have proved that immunotherapy works, they have now hit what we describe as a biological ceiling or therapeutic ceiling, as some people may call it. And that is where the focus has shifted now. So, the key question is no longer whether immunotherapy works. The question is how to make it work for the remaining 60 to 70% of patients who do not respond. So the next phase of innovation is about breaking through the ceiling. This includes new checkpoint targets, cancer vaccines, which can prime tumor-specific responses, and more scalable CAR-T treatments, and also combination strategies, which is a huge upcoming theme and which we will discuss in more detail later. So basically, the companies that can respond, increase the responder population and overcome resistance, move these treatments to earlier lines, are the most likely to generate the next wave of clinical impact. A very important aspect here is timing from an investment perspective. So as Neil mentioned, the industry is approaching a patent cliff, and over 200 billion in revenues are at risk by 2030. That creates real urgency for large pharma to secure the next generation of immuno-oncology assets that can extend or replace their revenues. So, in our report, we not only talk about scientific evolution in the space, but also why this progression and timing creates a fundamental opportunity for smaller biotechs and investors. So the smaller companies highlighted in the report are developing just what is required, which are combination relevant, resistant addressing therapies, platform technologies that are directly aligned with Big Pharma's most pressing strategic needs. And this alignment is what is driving the current wave of partnerships, licensing deals, M&A, and why we believe that this is such an important moment for investors to re-engage in the space.
Okay, so my three takeaways are you've got innovation, you've got effectively this idea that you can combine these sort of different approaches to become more effective, plus an economic necessity, this patent cliff, and so pharma being very active. You mentioned this idea of a biological ceiling, and I want to try and sort of demystify what a biological ceiling is. So can you explain that in plain terms, and again why that matters commercially?
Okay, so when we talk about biological ceiling or biologic ceiling, or also called therapeutic ceiling, we're really describing the limits of the first generation checkpoint inhibitors.
Mm.
We mentioned that there are 8 currently approved treatments, and if you look deeply, all of them work by targeting just 2 pathways: PD1, its ligand PDL1, and CTLA4. Now, in certain cancers, such as melanoma and non small cell lung cancer, these drugs have been transformative because these tumors are already called immune hot tumors. Basically, that means that they have a high level of T cell infiltration and active immune signaling. They also have high levels of PD1 expression. So, when you release the brakes from these checkpoint inhibitors, the immune system can immediately start attacking the cancers. Now, the challenge, as we previously mentioned also, is that a large number of tumors, such as pancreatic cancer, prostate cancer, ovarian cancer, are immune cold. They're not hot tumors. They have very little PD1 expression, very few cytotoxic T cells in the tumor microenvironment. So, in those settings, if you take the brakes of the immune system, it doesn't really achieve much because the immune response wasn't really engaged in the first place. And that's why checkpoint inhibitors on their own have relatively low response rates in these tumors. And the second part of the ceiling, which we were talking about, is within the tumor biology itself. So cancers are very smart, they're highly adaptive. So even when patients initially respond to these PD1 and CTLA treatments, tumors can activate alternate immunosuppressive pathways to escape immune attack. And that is why we often see strong early responses, but this is followed by resistance. So that is exactly why the field is now shifting towards combination treatments and next generation checkpoints, and also increasingly towards bispecific antibodies that can target multiple pathways simultaneously. Now, the goal is not to replace PD1, but to make it work in a much larger proportion of patients. From a commercial perspective, the ceiling is actually an opportunity. So, PD1 therapies already represent a large established market, and any new treatment that can increase response rates or overcome resistance can be added on top of the existing treatments. So that makes these next generation assets highly attractive to large pharma, which are looking to extend and defend their multi-billion dollar oncology franchises. So overall, we believe that the biologic ceiling is not just a scientific limitation, but a key driver for the next wave of innovation in this space.
Okay. And look, for me, who's a generalist rather than a healthcare specialist, I think these labels are helpful. So, I can identify, yeah, I may not necessarily know what it means, but at least I can identify PD1 and understand how it fits into this bucket. Beyond PD1, which new checkpoint targets should investors be watching? So I'm sure it's more than just PD1 that the industry is working on. And what's the clinical evidence telling us so far?
Absolutely. So the next focus is on the next generation of checkpoint inhibitors.
Mhm.
And we already have a proof of concept that inhibiting other checkpoints works. So one of the large pharma companies, BMS, has a drug called opaduolag, which is actually a combination of PD1 and another checkpoint inhibitor called LAG3. Now, LAG3 is the first new checkpoint inhibitor which is approved other than PD1 and CTLA4. And this combination was approved in melanoma in 2022. And it
Mhm.
showed that targeting a second checkpoint on top of PD1 can deliver meaningful clinical benefits. So, this is an important validation that we can look beyond the PD1 CTLA4 axis. Now, there are several other LAG3 inhibitors under development, and then there are other checkpoints in development as well, such as TIGIT, TIM, VISTA. We need to take a step back here and see that while there's a lot of excitement around the new generation of checkpoint inhibitors, not all of them have delivered on the promise. One of the examples I would like to cite here is TIGIT, which was probably one of the most sought after checkpoint inhibitors, with several big pharma companies investing billions of dollars in acquiring early stage assets in the early 2020s. However, we've seen multiple clinical programs have since failed to produce desirable results. Some of the major failures is a GSK acquired asset in 2021 for $1.45 billion, which failed. Novartis had acquired another asset in December 2021 for 700 billion, that also failed. So if we look overall, clinical failure rates for drugs can be as high as 85 to 90%. And even for a phase 2 asset, it can be over 50%. So this also highlights the inherent risk in biotech drug development. Now, where we are seeing renewed interest within the checkpoint space are the checkpoints with a differentiated biology, and particularly those that are relevant to immune cold tumors, which we've talked about previously. And VISTA is a good example. VISTA is a new generation checkpoint inhibitor. It is expressed in around 30% of solid tumors and has shown a synergy with PD-1 in preclinical studies. And in our report, we highlight the case of Percheron Therapeutics, which owns this asset, HMBD-002, which is moving towards phase 2 in combination with Keytruda. And it will provide an important readout on whether this mechanism can bring new patients into the responder pool. So that is what we are more excited about in the new generation checkpoint space for now.
Okay. We've seen quite a lot of deal flow in bispecific antibodies. So firstly, explain what bispecific antibodies are, and then also explain, why are pharma companies so excited about this format?
Right. So we just talked about targeting new checkpoints. There's another bigger strategic trend that we've seen, and that is moving towards a bispecific or multi-pathway inhibition within a single molecule. So basically, these drugs combine two or more mechanisms in a single molecule. So previously, we mentioned the combination of PD-1 and LAG3. Those were two separate molecules which were used together. But if you combine them into one single molecule, that is called a bispecific antibody. And a single molecule then allows more coordinated target engagement, simpler dosing, and a much stronger IP position as well. Now, there are trade-offs to this strategy. There is less flexibility in dose management, and then there's potential for increased toxicity as well. And obviously, when you're combining two molecules together, the manufacturing process becomes more complex. However, we've seen an increase in deal activity within space, and there's a lot of interest from big pharma in the bispecific space. And in particular, I would like to quote an example of PD-1 VEGF bispecifics. These bispecifics have been garnering a lot of interest from big pharma. And we've seen a number of M&A and licensing deals for these bispecifics recently. Now, VEGF is called vascular endothelial growth factors, which is a signaling protein that cancers use to stimulate formation of new blood vessels. Now, if you block VEGF, you starve the tumors of blood supply, which then helps the immune cells get inside the tumor and improve response to checkpoint inhibitors or PD-1, as we mentioned. So one of the biggest deals in this space has been the $11 billion partnering agreement between BMS and BioNTech, which was announced in June 2025. And this was based on a very compelling phase 2 data in non-small cell lung cancer. I believe the overall response rate in this study was over 80%, which is extremely good. In historical cohorts, the response rate has been limited to 60 to 65%. So I think this is kind of driving the interest in this space. And there are some other big deals as well, including Pfizer and 3S Bio and AbbVie and Remgen. And a major point I would like to make here is that the deal sizes and high payout is not just a factor of the clinical data and commercial potential, but there's also another angle of life cycle management. So as the PD-1s move towards loss of exclusivity, single agent PD-1 assets will face competition from biosimilars. A bispecific that combines PD-1 with another pathway is a new chemical entity. It's patent protected, which allows companies to defend their price and market share. So for large pharma, bispecifics are not just about better efficacy, they're also a franchise protection strategy. So that's why there's so much interest in this space.
Okay, and I think you touched on the fact that there are while there's the promise of outset, if you get this right, there is a very large market, etc., and substantial gains to be made. But there's risks on the way, and you highlighted earlier that there are failures and quite high probabilities of failure. So typically cancer vaccines have had a long history of disappointment, but the report feels like that's changed. So help us explain, why investors should be taking them more seriously now.
So yes, cancer vaccines is the second pillar within the immuno-oncology space, which we covered in our report. And yes, you rightly mentioned they've had a checkered past, unlike checkpoint inhibitors and CAR-Ts. So cancer vaccines work by training the immune system to recognize and attack cancer cells. So basically, they identify target antigens or proteins that are expressed on cancer cells. They delivered a weakened form of that antigen in the body, and this triggers an immune response. So the first therapeutic cancer vaccine, Provenge, was approved in 2010, and this was even before the approval of checkpoint inhibitors. So this was approved for prostate cancer, but since then, a series of high-profile failures from companies like GSK and Merck for the late-stage programs sort of have dampened the sentiment around cancer vaccines. Now, if we look back in hindsight, there were three reasons why cancer vaccines failed. One was the choice of the wrong target antigen, the wrong patient population, and the wrong treatment setting. So most of the previous vaccines focused on what we call shared tumor antigens, which are expressed in large number on cancer cells, but are also expressed on normal tissue. So the immune system is naturally tolerant of them, and the response is therefore not as strong. These vaccines were also tested in late stage disease with a high tumor burden, and cancer vaccines actually take a long time, a few weeks to actually increase their impact. So when you target late stage diseases, there simply isn't enough time to generate a meaningful immune response. And lastly, they were tested as monotherapies, and we've seen and we've discussed that immuno-oncology now works best as combination treatments. So what has changed now? What has changed is that pharma has learned from its mistakes, and both the biology and technology of cancer vaccines has progressed. Now, new generation vaccines are targeting new antigens, and these are different from shared antigens because new antigens are only expressed by cancer cells, which makes the immune response far more specific and potent. At the same time, the field now has new delivery platforms such as mRNA, DNA, viral vectors, which are capable of driving much stronger and more durable T cell activation and are also scalable from a manufacturing perspective. But the most important factor of all is that vaccines are no longer being developed as standalone therapies. They're now being positioned as immune primers for checkpoint inhibitors. And this fits much better with the current standard of care. I think the real turning point in the cancer vaccine space was the Moderna Merck study for its asset V940, and this was in combination with Keytruda, which is the best-selling immune checkpoint inhibitors. And this combination showed a 44% reduction in risk of death in melanoma versus treatment with Keytruda alone. And that is when big pharma became interested in this space again. So,
Okay.
in addition, yeah.
No, sorry. No, finish, JT, because I'm
I was
gonna
just
ask
going
about
to
the
add another
coverage.
point is that in addition to being treated as combination treatments, um, cancer vaccines have also moved into earlier treatment settings. So, for example, adjuvant and minimal residual disease, where the immune system is intact and the tumor burden is low. So, in all, the new generation cancer vaccines no longer come with the overhang of the previous generation, and have been redesigned to be synergistic with checkpoints. And the other difference is that these vaccines are now targeting spaces where checkpoints have not been as effective, such as blood cancers.
Okay. And I wanted to ask, actually, within the companies that you cover, what differentiates them? What separates the approach?
So, in terms of cancer vaccines,
Yeah.
okay, so again, we would try to like to reiterate and put across this message for investors that cancer vaccines, as we know them now, the newer generation cancer vaccines, are not a homogeneous category. Different companies are taking different approaches, clinical and technological, and this has created different risk reward profiles. We previously talked about neoantigen vaccines, which are specific to the tumors. So these vaccines can be peptide based or viral vector based, and they can either be personalized or off the shelf. Now, an example of a personalized vaccine is Transgene's TG4050, which is a fully individualized neoantigen vaccine, and this is designed individually for each patient based on the particular mutation in their tumor. So this gives you the potential for a very potent and highly tumor specific immune response, but it also means longer and more complex manufacturing. At the other end of the spectrum is another company we've covered in our report called OSC Immunotherapeutics. It's called a phase 3 product, Tidopi, which is an off the shelf peptide vaccine. Now, this is faster to deliver, it's easier to scale, and it's already in phase 3, but it's not customized for each patient. So, this is one differentiation between personalized and off the shelf. And the second layer of differentiation comes from the platforms on their own. So, another company we mentioned in the report is called Scancell. It's a UK based firm. It uses a DNA based approach, and it has its own immunobody platform, which is designed to generate very specific T cell responses. Transgene, as we mentioned before, uses a viral vector platform. There's another company which we mentioned in the report called Mendes, which uses a dendritic cell strategy, which is
Yeah.
particularly suited to blood cancers such as AML. And OSC, as we mentioned, has a peptide approach. So each of these approaches have implications for cost, manufacturing, and partnering potential. And
Okay.
finally, the third aspect here is where the product actually sit in the treatment pathway. So some of these programs are being delivered in solid tumors in combination with checkpoints. Other, like Mendes, is being focused more on the blood cancer space. So for investors, differentiation is not just about the science. It's about potency versus scalability, and the speed to the market versus long-term upside from early stage investment programs, and how each product is then positioned within the overall treatment landscape.
Okay. Now, CAR-T is an area that we've sort of talked about within this. So it's delivered sort of what we think are sort of genuinely curative results, but it's been limited in its approach. I mean, I remember when it sort of first came about, just how excited people are. What's the key bottleneck, and how is the industry sort of addressing it?
Yes, exactly. So CAR-T is one of the most exciting and powerful innovations we've seen in oncology. And in certain blood cancer, it has delivered nearly curative outcomes. However, despite the success, there are significant limitations to CAR-Ts. And if you look at the current landscape of approved treatment within the CAR-T space, there are currently 6 CAR-Ts which are approved. 4 of them are targeting the CD19 protein, and 2 of them are targeting BCMA. So it's fairly concentrated in terms of the target. And we know that cancers are biologically very adaptive. So in blood malignancies, which CAR-Ts are targeting, the cells can stop expressing CD19 or BCMA as a resistant mechanism in something which we call antigen escape, which ultimately may result in relapse for these patients. A big constraint, another one for CAR-Ts, is toxicity. Because CAR-T cells trigger such a strong immune response, they also lead to systemic inflammation called cytokine release syndrome. Now, CRS, as we call it, occurs in over 70% of patients who are treated with CAR-T therapies, and this can be life-threatening. There is also the potential of developing neurotoxicity, which can be severe as well. So that's the reason why CAR-T treatments need to be administered specialist centers under intensive monitoring. And the third biggest issue is manufacturing complexity. All the current cells are extracted from the body, genetically engineered to express the chimeric antigen receptor, which is the CAR part of the treatment, and then they are reintroduced into the body. So this is a highly personalized, labor-intensive, and expensive process, and it can take weeks, which limits scalability and access. Now, the next generation of CAR-Ts are trying to address these bottlenecks. One of the approaches which the next generation is taking is something called dual CAR-T constructs, so which are actually targeting 2 proteins at the same time. So for example, CD19 and CD22. So this is aimed at reducing antigen escape. Another big shift is towards off-the-shelf CAR-Ts or allogenic CAR-Ts, as we call them. So these don't use the patient-derived cells, they use donor-derived cells, which improves access and turnaround times. A key example of a company developing allogenic CAR-Ts is Allogene Therapeutics, whose lead asset is in a potentially registrational phase 2 trial. So if it's successful, it will be a pivotal milestone for the space as a whole. And safety, because we talked about cytokine release syndrome, is also a major focus. Now, the newer CAR-Ts are designing better control mechanisms to mitigate toxicity. And other than that, the CRS challenge has also created opportunities for adjustment which is related to CAR-T treatment. So an example which we cite in our report is a UK-based Poolbeck Pharma, which is developing POLB 001, which is an oral preventative therapy for CAR-T-related CRS. And this it's first in class. And the most important so we mentioned that in CAR-T, the cells need to be extracted and then reinfused. But in the case of these cells are programmed directly inside the patient using technologies such as viral vectors, lipid nanoparticles, etc. So this approach bypasses the ex vivo manufacturing entirely. And if successful, it could reduce cost, timeline, shorten the timelines, and enable outpatient administration. So it can really expand the scope of CAR-T treatments. And this is one area where big pharma has shown a lot of interest. There's been many multi-billion-dollar deals recently, and the most recent of it has been Eli Lilly's acquisition of Orna Therapeutics for $2.4 billion. And this deal was announced just a few days back. And this asset is in vivo CAR-Ts are seeing from the market. So in short, CAR-Ts have proven their curative potential. The next phase depends on solving the issue of relapse, safety, and manufacturing. Highlight that multiple innovations are now targeting these very challenges.
Okay, Jyoti, now you froze a couple of times when you're giving that answer, so I am still here. What I'm going to do, just to save the bandwidth, is we'll get on to solid tumor, which I think is really exciting, etc. But I will cut my camera, so hopefully it gives you a free rein to talk about it. So solid tumors have been described as possibly the biggest expansion opportunity for CAR-T. I just want to understand, how realistic this is and how near it is from a timeline perspective.
Right. So we often say that solid tumors are the holy grail for CAR-T, and that's simply because they represent more than 90% of the overall cancer cases. So CAR-Ts have delivered remarkable outcomes in blood cancers, but solid tumors has been very limited. So from a purely commercial perspective, this is the largest long-term opportunity for CAR-Ts because that's 90% of the market.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Was that I thought you'd finished. So was there anything else you wanted
Yes,
to make?
yes. So I just wanted to provide the other point of view as well. So basically, the challenge with solid tumors is also that they are far more complex biologically. And in blood cancers, you often have clean targets such as CD19 and BCMA. In solid tumors, the disease is highly heterogeneous to different places in the tumor itself. So it's a highly complex target versus blood cancers. And on top of that, the tumor microenvironment also plays a role, and this can often be immunosuppressive. And line and success rates. And so we have to be more realistic about the potential of CAR-Ts in this space. This is obviously not going to be a near-term story for CAR-Ts. It will require more longer-term clinical efforts, and therefore it remains high risk. But it's also the area where the biggest upside sits. And that is why both companies and investors remain very focused on this area.
Okay, so I'm conscious of time, and I think the two big areas that, from an investment perspective, that we probably want to understand is the patent cliff. So I do want to, if we have time, we'll come back to other details within the report, but perhaps let's move on to the patent cliff, which is a sort of key theme, effectively, in terms of what makes this area interesting. So walk us through, where we are at the patent cliff, why it creates an opportunity specifically for smaller companies, which we've talked about in the report. And then we'll get on to also thinking about risk and reward after that.
The patent cliff is really the commercial engine which is tying the entire theme together. So by 2013, we're looking at over 200 billion of big pharma revenues coming off patent, and a large portion programs, and you need to look outside for novel, innovative programs with commercial potential. So for big pharma, the fastest and lowest risk is to acquire or partner these assets to either extend the PD-1. We've already seen that happening with the multi-billion-dollar deals which we talked about in the bispecific space. This also creates an upside potential for companies with differentiated assets and innovative assets. So if they have a drug that improves response rates, overcomes resistance, or is scalable, these companies immediately become strategically relevant for big pharma. And that's exactly how companies in this report are positioned. They're not there to replace Keytruda. They're there to be combination treatments. Precisely what large pharma needs to defend and rebuild its oncology franchise.
Okay, I mean, I think we're having a couple of bandwidth issues, I think, on the webinar. But let me summarize, because clearly I have read the report. So just to summarize it, there is this massive patent cliff, and there's something like $200 billion worth of drug revenues at risk by 2030, and it's very concentrated in a group of large cap farmers. Their response is basically to acquire or partner, either taking on the next generation of assets or things that extend the life effectively of their PD-1 assets. And it's creating effectively quite a lot of opportunity in the small cap space, because it's the smaller companies that are sort of developing effectively these assets, and that's what makes the whole area interesting. It's the nimble companies who are sort of getting on, innovating, etc., are starting to develop this. There is a question that's come in, but we'll come on to that in a second. For when you're thinking about the risk reward, so clearly, we've done one of these previously, actually looking at healthcare investment trust, which is, if you're not a specialist, maybe a good way of getting exposure is through a basket of assets. But I think you can help people navigate effectively the different risk profiles and the different rewards that you have across these sort of different modalities. So how should a generalist investor think about the risk reward across these sort of different sort of treatments that you've described?
So I think the easiest way for a generalist investor to think about risk reward in this space is look at it as a spectrum opportunity. So at the lower risk end, you have next generation checkpoint inhibitors, and these are already built on validated PD-1 backbones. So the biology is relatively de-risked, but there's also high competition in this space. If we look at the middle level of risk, we would say cancer vaccines. Here, the upside is meaningful because we are seeing real clinical traction, but the field is still in the process of proving consistent late-stage outcomes. And at the highest risk category, but also the highest reward category, is CAR-T, and in particular in solid tumors and in vivo cell therapy. The timelines are definitely longer in this space. The technical challenges are greater, but if these approaches work, the addressable market expands very significantly as well. And I just want to add another point is that for generalists, they don't really have to wait for commercial sales to see the returns. So value is actually being created earlier in the stage of development. So value is being created based on strong clinical data, licensing deals, co-development partnerships, and M&A. And we've seen this happen repeatedly in immuno-oncology. So that is what I would like to conclude with in terms of how generalists should look at in this space.
Okay. Now, we are getting some questions coming in, so I do want to address those. But my final sort of question, if there's anything else that you think that is really important, we can come on to that. For investors looking at this immuno-oncology for the first time, what's the single most important thing they should understand about where this field is heading?
So I think the single most important takeaway is that immuno-oncology, as we know of, was about proving the concept, and that's now done. The next decade will be about scaling this. Is how we can make treatments work for the 60 to 70% of patients who don't moment in time particularly meaningful is that there is a convergence of sciences with economics. The science is maturing. There are multiple new tools being explored, and we discussed that. And at the same time, there is this upcoming patent cliff. So big pharma urgently needs new immuno-oncology assets. And we're already seeing large capital flows in this space through partnerships and M&A, which sort of validates this demand. So this has resulted in a dynamic where means that an exit pathway is already built in for small pharma. So overall, I would like to wrap up by saying that immuno-oncology is moving from a validation phase into expansion, and the companies that can broaden the responder population are the ones which are positioned to create the most value over the next decade.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm also going to summarize that because you froze a little bit, but basically, it's moved from, I think the way we described it is, does this work, to actually it does work, and how do we get the best result for patients? And it's combining itself with compelling economics effectively. And for the companies working in this space, there's a greater certainty of actually realizing value. I think that's a good way of putting it together. Let's jump into some questions, Jyoti. So Ray has asked, what's the response of professionals to the launch of Autolus Therapeutics? And I may pronounce this wrong, Orcatzil?
Which treatment are you talking about?
Was it Autolus Therapeutics or Capsule? You may not know it. This field of space. We can always come back to Ray if we don't have the answer.
Yes, I'm going to come back to you on email on this question.
Okay, fine. Dave asked, in terms of the different combination therapies, the checkpoint inhibitors have come off patent. If they can be combined with a new therapy in a specific setting, could they extend their patent life? I think you tried to cover that off, but maybe be explicit on that. Yeah.
Exactly. So combination treatments are a way for life cycle management. So obviously we discussed that the PD-1, so we mentioned Keytruda and Opdivo, both of them are coming off patent in 2028. So when you combine this treatment with another treatment, it gives you a market extension. So there is an additional market exclusivity which you get when you combine the treatment. And this is even greater if the two treatments are then combined into one molecule, which we call bispecifics. So that is a big tool for big pharma to extend life cycle management and protect their revenues in the near future.
Okay, and Ray has clarified with the phonetic spelling of the drug, which is Oversell. If you know it, then you can respond to it. Otherwise, we'll get back to Ray via email. There was another question, which is that for a lot of these smaller companies, and they pick Scancell as an example, the shareholder register is very concentrated. In your experience, I mean, when they go through, if there is a transaction that may be structured effectively, if either there is a sort of significant sort of flow of revenues coming to them, how does that, what happens to the register? How does it become more diversified? I mean, I have a view on this as well, but maybe you working in the space, what have you seen when companies start striking deals with large cap pharma? How does the register tend to move?
So if we look at heavily skewed towards retail investors, which have a long-term horizon. But when these deals starts happening, when there's a lot of interest from big pharma, then you see a lot of interest from institutions as well. So you can definitely see the structure of the register changing when there is talk about a deal, or when there is an actual talk happening. And this is not just specific to that particular company. So for example, if that company is operating in a particular field and another company sort of has a deal in the same space, then that by default gets a lot of interest for this company as well from institutional investors. So definitely that is one aspect. And as companies progress through the clinical stages, as they grow, the register changes with more institutional investors come in.
Yeah, and I would add, I mean, we've been watching companies sort of grow through the space. So, as you do get institutions buying on, and then increasingly you get a diversity of those institutions. So it's not just domestic institutions, but a lot of those companies want to reach out to the US, which is a very rich pool of capital for healthcare. It's where a lot of the deals are done. And you start to get these sort of specialist investors from the US starting to come onto the register as well. Specifically for the UK, you've seen a lot of delistings and sort of companies sort of disappearing in the UK healthcare space, and the concern is that there are low valuations on UK assets. Do you see that impacting the pricing of any transactions, i.e., people are being opportunistic, or do you think actually the management teams, can hold their own and extract the right kind of price?
So I think the last few years have been quite challenging for pharma as a whole, and there has been a lot of opportunistic transactions. So I think companies have to be flexible. The companies who have not been flexible have sort of moved out of the system as well. But now, currently, if you look at the environment, things are changing. The overall capital market environment is improving. The macro environment around the sector is improving. There is renewed interest in this space. And I feel now is the time where the companies which can hold off should be able to hold off for the right price, for the right deal. So I think in today's day and age, I think things have improved for the sector as a whole, and within the UK as well, companies can hold their own.
Jyoti, thank you very much. For those who want access to the report, it's available on our website. It's also available via our LinkedIn feed, so please do take a look. Ray, we owe you an answer, and we will come back to you. We have colleagues in the US, etc., and so as a team, we'll come back
If Ray
come
can
back.
just let me know the name of the company which he was talking about.
I'll pass it on, and we'll pass the answer back to Pavlina. She can pass it on to Ray. Thank you very much for tuning in, and hopefully, please do sort of come back to us if there's any other sort of topics. We do like doing this. We do want to sort of continue working with ShareSoc in terms of different sectors and bringing them up the curve. I will hand back to Mike. My challenge at the beginning when I spoke to Mike was demystifying the space. Hopefully, Mike, you feel a little bit wiser after that.
It gave me a good feel for it, actually. I was, I sort of lost the plot a bit when I was trying to read the report, but I'll go back. I can go back to it now knowing a little bit more than I did when I started, so that's useful. So I am getting a bit more familiar with the terminology, which helps, I think, in these new markets that I'm trying to get my head around. So thank you, Jyoti, and thanks, Neil. Apologies to the audience because we did have quite a lot of problems with your audio, Jyoti, at times, but I think we got the general gist of it, and Neil did a good job of filling in occasionally where there were some gaps. So yeah, but as Neil said, there's a whole report on the website now that's it's quite interesting, actually. So you should have a look at that as well if you want to fill in with a bit more detail. So thanks again.